The mirror that knows too much. It was an old mirror, framed in ornate silver, the edges slightly tarnished by age. Emma had found it in an antique store on the outskirts of town, buried beneath dusty crates and forgotten treasures. The shopkeeper, a frail man with thinning hair and a quiet demeanor, had watched her pick it up with an unsettling intensity. "That mirror's been in my family for generations," he said, his voice low and heavy with warning. "It knows things. Things it shouldn't." Emma laughed it off, assuming it was just a sales tactic. She had always been drawn to strange objects, things with history, things that told stories. The mirror, with its mysterious aura, seemed like the perfect addition to her collection. She bought it, and when she brought it home, it looked even more beautiful in her apartment. It wasn't anything extravagant, just an ordinary piece to hang above her fireplace, but something about it felt different, alive almost. The first night after placing it on the wall, Emma felt a strange unease as she gazed into the reflection. It wasn't the mirror itself, but something about the way it seemed to absorb the light, how the shadows in the glass seemed deeper, darker than they should be. Over the next few days she began to notice small, unsettling details. The reflection in the mirror would sometimes linger a moment longer than she did when she turned away. And once, she swore she saw someone standing behind her in the reflection, just for a split second, but when she spun around, the room was empty. It was on the third night, as she sat alone in her living room, that she finally heard the voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. She looked up, heart racing, and saw that her reflection hadn't moved. But her reflection was looking at her, its eyes dark and knowing. "I know what you've done," the voice said, the words slow and deliberate. Emma's blood ran cold. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor as she turned to face the mirror. But there was nothing, just her own face staring back at her. Her reflection was perfectly still, almost too still. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice shaky. The reflection didn't answer. But in that moment, Emma felt it, a presence behind her, something that wasn't quite right. She turned around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. The air grew heavier, colder. She looked back at the mirror again, and this time it was different. The edges of the reflection were warped, as if the mirror was distorting the reality it reflected. She reached out a hand to touch the glass, and as her fingers brushed against it, the surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. The voice came again, only this time it was clearer. It was coming from the mirror, as though it was speaking directly into her mind. "I know your secrets, Emma. I know everything about you." Her heart pounded in her chest. How could it know? She hadn't told anyone about the mistake she made years ago, the thing that still haunted her. She had buried it deep inside, hoping it would stay forgotten. But now the mirror knew. It knew everything. She stumbled back from the mirror, her hands shaking. But the voice didn't stop. "You can't hide from me. You can't escape the truth." Her knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to leave, to break the mirror and end whatever was happening, but she couldn't move. The mirror held her, its reflection pulling at her like a tidal wave, drowning her in memories she had long tried to forget. Suddenly the reflection in the glass shifted. Her face no longer looked like her own. It was someone else, someone she recognized. A man. His face was obscured by shadows, but the eyes were unmistakable. "You were never meant to forget," the voice said, its tone cold and accusatory. "I remember everything, Emma. And I will remind you." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The man in the reflection was the one she had wronged. The one who had vanished years ago. The one she had thought was lost to the world forever. But now he was back, staring at her from the depths of the mirror, and she realized with a sickening clarity that it wasn't just the mirror that knew too much. It was him. The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with a suffocating pressure. She reached out, desperate to touch the mirror, to end the torment. But as her fingers brushed the glass once more, it pulled her in. Her reflection warped, distorting, twisting, until she could no longer tell where the glass ended and reality began. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the voice, cold and final. "You will never escape me, Emma. I know you." And then, silence. The next morning, the mirror was gone. Emma searched her apartment, frantic, but there was no trace of it. It was as if it had never been there at all. But when she passed a store window on her way to work, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection. And for the briefest moment she saw him again, the man from the mirror, standing just behind her, his eyes dark with knowing. And she knew with a cold certainty that the mirror hadn't just vanished. It had found a new home. It had found her. Emma didn't sleep for days after that encounter. Every reflective surface became a source of paranoia. She taped over mirrors, avoided puddles, and even unplugged her phone, afraid to see her reflection staring back at her with eyes that weren't her own. But avoidance could only last so long. One night, while sitting in the darkness of her living room, her phone buzzed unexpectedly, the glow of the screen cutting through the shadows. She hadn't plugged it back in. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The notification on the screen read, "You can't hide forever." Her fingers hovered over the screen, frozen, before the phone buzzed again. This time a photo appeared. It was her apartment, but not as it looked now. It was how it had appeared years ago, filled with old furniture she had replaced long ago. And in the center of the image was the mirror. The ornate, silver-framed mirror. Her blood ran cold. She had taken that photo herself the day she first hung it above her fireplace. The screen went black. She threw the phone across the room in panic, the clatter echoing in the silence. A faint knocking sound broke through her terror. It was coming from the hallway outside her door. 3 deliberate raps, then silence. Emma stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. When the knocking resumed, louder this time, she forced herself to move. Slowly she approached the door, peering through the peephole. No one was there. But just as she stepped back, the faintest sound whispered through the door. "I see you, Emma." Her breath caught. She stumbled back, knocking over a chair in her panic. Her mind raced. Was she losing her sanity? Or was this truly happening? The lights flickered. Then they went out completely, plunging her apartment into darkness. Her pulse roared in her ears as she groped blindly for her phone. When she finally found it, the screen flickered to life. The camera app had opened on its own, and in the frame she saw the reflection of her living room, but it was wrong. The mirror was back. It hung above the fireplace, pristine as the day she bought it, its silver surface gleaming. And in the reflection stood the man, his form clearer now, his shadowed eyes locked onto hers. The voice returned, louder than before, resonating from everywhere and nowhere. "You brought me here, Emma. Now you must face what you've done." Tears blurred her vision as memories surged forward, memories she had buried deep. The argument, the push, the fall, the blood. She shook her head, muttering, "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "Lies," the voice hissed. The mirror's surface rippled, and the man's hand reached out, his fingers clawing at the air as if trying to pull himself free. Emma screamed, backing away. She had to end this. She had to destroy it. Snatching up the iron poker from her fireplace, she lunged at the mirror, swinging with all her strength. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the apartment, shards raining down around her. But instead of relief, the room grew colder, darker. The shards on the floor didn't reflect her. They reflected him. Piece by piece, his image grew clearer, his form assembling from the broken fragments. "You can't destroy the truth," the voice said, now deep and echoing. The man stepped from the shards, whole and solid, his presence suffocating. Emma scrambled back, her body trembling. "What do you want from me?" "To remember. To pay." His hand extended, and as his fingers touched her forehead, her world dissolved into darkness. When Emma awoke, she was no longer in her apartment. She stood in a vast, endless expanse of mirrors, each one showing a different version of herself, happy, angry, grieving. And in every reflection, the man stood behind her, his shadow an unshakable constant. "You will stay here," he said, his voice surrounding her. "Until you understand." Her screams echoed through the void, but no one was there to hear them. Outside, in the real world, a young couple wandered through the antique store on the outskirts of town. Their eyes landed on an ornate silver-framed mirror, its edges slightly tarnished. The shopkeeper smiled faintly as they reached for it. "That mirror's been in my family for generations," he said. "It knows things. Things it shouldn't." Emma sat in the endless expanse of mirrors, each one reflecting fragments of her life, moments she had cherished, regretted, and buried deep. In every reflection, the man loomed behind her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, anger, sorrow, or vengeance. "What do you want me to see?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I can't change the past." The man stepped closer, his presence dominating the surreal space. "You never faced it," he said. "You ran. You lied. And because of that, I am trapped." The memories came rushing back, no longer fragments but vivid, unrelenting truths. His name was Marcus, a colleague and friend who had uncovered a scandal at their workplace, a corruption that could have cost Emma her job and reputation. In a heated confrontation at a company retreat, she had pushed him in desperation, sending him tumbling down a steep ravine. She hadn't meant for him to fall, but when his body didn't surface, she panicked. Instead of seeking help, she had covered it up, convinced herself it was an accident, and buried the memory deep. The mirror, it seemed, had absorbed the truth. And Marcus's spirit, tethered by Emma's guilt and his unresolved fate, had taken refuge in its depths. "You think you can absolve yourself by breaking me?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "The mirror doesn't just reflect, it reveals. It shows what's hidden." Emma fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I was scared. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know how to make it right." "You never tried," he replied coldly. "But now you have a chance." The mirrors surrounding Emma began to shimmer, their surfaces rippling like water. A voice, softer and older, echoed through the void. "The mirror was forged from the sands of truth and fire of judgment," it said. "It reveals the burdens mortals refuse to carry, trapping them in the web of their own deceit until they confront their sins." Emma's reflection changed, showing her standing by Marcus's body at the ravine's edge, her face a mask of fear and guilt. She reached out to touch the image, her fingers trembling. "What can I do to fix this?" she asked the void. "Accept the weight of your actions," the voice replied. "Free him by freeing yourself." The world of mirrors dissolved, and Emma found herself standing once more at the ravine where it all happened. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and earth. In her hand was a small silver shard of the mirror, pulsing faintly with light. She knew what she had to do. Returning to her hometown, Emma sought out the authorities. She led them to the ravine and told them everything: her argument with Marcus, the fall, and her cover-up. Search teams scoured the area and discovered Marcus's remains, long hidden beneath the underbrush. The discovery brought closure to his family, who had spent years wondering what had happened to him. That night, as Emma sat alone in her apartment, she felt the air lighten, the oppressive weight she had carried for so long lifting. She looked at the shard of the mirror, now dull and lifeless. Marcus had been freed, his spirit no longer bound by the secrets she had kept.